Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to our joint webinar with Varonis titled Insiders Are the New Malware. My name is George Nikonarov, and I will be assisting with moderating today. During this presentation, we urge you to send questions directly to the host or through the questions and answer box. Questions will be answered sequentially. We have a great webinar lined up for you today, but first, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce Patrick Field, Senior Account Manager with Sphere Technology Solutions. Patrick.
George, thank you for the introduction. I'd like to say thank you for everyone for joining for today, and welcome to today's webinar. As George said, my name is Patrick Fields. I'm a Senior Account Manager with Sphere Technology Solutions, and I'd like to share with you a brief introduction to Sphere Technology Solutions so that you will know who we are, what we do, and how our clients benefit from working with us. Sphere is focused on improving security and enhancing compliance through the implementation of effective governance programs. We achieve this by providing the analytics that measure risk, executing on remediation programs to reduce risk, and deploying automation solutions to effectively manage risk for our customers. We solve these complex challenges by integrating services that are delivered by our team of SMEs with best-of-breed technologies. These technologies include both leading third-party solutions, such as the Varonis suite of solutions, and Sphere's bespoke governance technologies. When we view a client's technology landscape from a high level, we see three core components. Those are featured here in the center of this diagram. We have data. Data is the information that all companies create and use each day in the operation of their business. We have systems, and systems are where the data lives. Systems can be on-premise, they can be off-premise, or they can be cloud. The most common scenario that we see in the marketplace is a hybrid approach, a combination of all three system types. And then there's access. Data and systems must be accessed by employees, partners, and customers in order for your business to function. And the access to data and systems must consider the needs of each of these three constituents. Now, in isolation, managing those three things seems fairly simple, but then you have to start considering some other factors. Security. What are the threats an organization must defend against? Are these threats internal? Are these threats external? Or are they both? And then compliance. What are the regulations that apply to your industry, and how do you abide by those regulations? And then governance. What is the target operating model for data? What's your target operating model for systems? And how do you manage access? How are you going to maintain that target operating model? So Sphere, we tackle the governance, security, and compliance challenges by delivering visibility into the environment, developing the policies that are needed to manage the environment, conducting remediation programs that reduce risk for our customers, and then automating processes to prevent a return of the security and compliance concerns. So how we do this? We identify security and compliance concerns, remediate the risk, and create the governance model to prevent a return of the challenges by first collecting and analyzing metadata from a target environment. This enables Sphere to produce the key risk indicators that are necessary to manage risk. Key risk indicators are created by applying business intelligence to the collected metadata. There's three facets of the business intelligence that we utilize. There are industry best practices, there are Sphere's best practices, and then there is our customer's business intelligence. Now, when a customer is conducting an assessment, the key risk indicators are going to be static because this is a snapshot of the health of your organization at a single time. Yet that snapshot provides a tremendous amount of value because you can craft a plan to remediate risk using a risk prioritized approach. Now, during a remediation, KRIs start to become very interesting because you will notice that the risk in the organization is moving to a more positive place. Lastly, when you then deploy automation within your environment, you're now managing by the key risk indicators, and risk mitigation is now a business as usual activity for your organization. I'd like to share with you some specific examples of how our clients have benefited from engaging with Sphere. To improve security for one of our customers, we went in and we identified over 2 million files containing sensitive data where access to those files did not follow the firm's accepted standard. This customer then engaged Sphere in a remediation effort to lock down access to this data and then establish a permissions model based on the principle of least privilege. The implementation of these measures are going to prevent this customer from becoming a victim of the very next highly publicized data breach. To mitigate risk for another of our clients, Sphere conducted an enterprise-wide entitlement review for technology assets, certifying assets with more than 5,000 owners. We then automated this process so that this customer can now maintain an accurate book of record for technology ownership. This client now understands the business context in which each of these technology assets must be managed. To improve regulatory compliance for another of our customers, Sphere developed and deployed the controls that are necessary to enforce information barriers that are required by outside regulators to support the ethical walls between business segments. Furthermore, we established alerts to identify instances when attempts are made to pierce these barriers. This customer is no longer subject to audit failures and regulatory actions. I'm sure many of you have questions about Sphere and how we work with our customers. Please feel free to reach out to us using the contact information you now see on your screen, or by asking a question during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. However, at this time, I'd like to introduce Brian Vecchi from Varonis. Brian is going to share with you how to strengthen your firm's security posture to protect against insider threats. Just a little bit about Brian. He's a 19-year veteran of the information technology and data security space, holds a number of certifications, including the CISSP certification, and has served in application development, system architecture, project management, and business analyst roles across a wide variety of interests. He's currently a technical evangelist for Varonis Systems, and he's extremely passionate about helping organizations of all sizes get the most value from their data with the least amount of risk. Brian?
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, let me share out my presentation here. Thank you all so much for taking the time today to join us. It's really a pleasure for me to speak with you and to talk to you about how Varonis can help you better manage and protect your unstructured data. So, as mentioned, my name is Brian. I'm a technical evangelist here at Varonis. I've been here since 2010. There's my Twitter if you want to follow me. We've got a great blog on Varonis.com. It doesn't just talk about Varonis. In fact, most of the content is about security, and data issues in general. Some really fascinating stuff there if you want to check out and learn some more. If you're not familiar with Varonis, and I'm actually kind of hoping that most of you that have joined us today aren't familiar with Varonis, because that means you'll learn the most. Our company came about, it was kind of an interesting story. So our founders were pretty smart technical guys. They were professional services guys for NetApp. Some of you may be NetApp customers. If you're not, you don't know who NetApp is, NetApp makes big storage devices, big NAS devices that store lots and lots of data. So there was an oil company, a French oil company, drilling off the coast of Africa. They were sending divers down. They were sending submersibles down. They were taking pictures. They were taking videos, all in the service of finding places to drill for oil. And as you can imagine, that's a pretty expensive endeavor trying to take all those pictures. They were storing all of those pictures, all of those images, all of those videos, all of that data. They were storing that on you guessed right, a NetApp. They had hundreds and hundreds of terabytes of data, and one day it was all gone. All of the video, all of the images, all of the what I think was a $40 million project, all of it was gone. And as I bet you can imagine, this oil company ran to NetApp and said, what happened? Was this a competitor that stole this data? Was this a malicious insider, someone who had access to the data legitimately and then did something wrong with this? Was this an accident? Did somebody make a mistake? but even if you can't answer all that, can you just tell us the people who could have access to this data? They called in their two smartest guys. They spent weeks writing SQL scripts, writing PowerShell scripts, trying to dig in and figure out exactly what had happened to this data. Specifically, they were trying to answer some really basic questions. They were trying to answer who had access to the data, who did touch the data, what happened to it, how did they get that access, was it an accident, was it a mistake, or was it an insider attack? Did they have more that they needed to worry about? In the end, these two guys, Yaki and Ahad, thought, you know what, data and a management and security and protection of data is really, really important because we couldn't answer a lot of these questions. So they left NetApp, they formed a company, and that's Varonis. That's where we came from. We came literally from a place of engineers trying to figure out a better way to monitor and protect unstructured data. It's the data that we know we have the most of and we know the least about, typically. Fast forward to today. If you're on this webinar, you care about data security, I don't have to remind you of all of the high-profile and not even high-profile breaches over the last few years. It seems like there's a new one every single week or sometimes every single day. There's a huge amount of data out there. We're creating it. We're not monitoring how it's being used. We don't know who has access to it. And what's even more critically, there's more sensitive, valuable, regulated data on more platforms that we need to manage and protect to keep ourselves out of the news, to keep ourselves from being the next Home Depot, Target, Anthem, Sony, OPM, what have you. Many of these breaches have a lot in common. First, the threat was often already inside. It was often already an insider who had access or an insider whose credentials got hijacked because of phishing, email, or what have you. But the threat itself was already inside. Unstructured data is what's getting stolen or leaked. Unstructured data is, as our CEO, Yaki, likes to say, a complete information product. The amount of intelligence that you can get from one high-level PowerPoint presentation or one compensation spreadsheet, payroll file, or one internal financial report is massive. It's huge. We're not talking about transactional records in a database. We're talking about data that has all kinds of valuable information within a single file. And that's how that data becomes portable. That's how we collaborate. That's how we, as users and as technologists, we use data in unstructured formats these days. And traditional approaches didn't work. 87% of security spending last year was on the perimeter. And I think that's over the last 10 years. Think about that. 87%, almost 9 out of $10 that we spend on security, we spend at the perimeter trying to keep people out. But if the threat's already inside, you need to spend some time and energy making sure that the data inside is secure as well. You can certainly spend time and energy securing your perimeter. That's important. But what we're seeing is that securing data from the inside out is just as or even more important. Once you move data to the cloud, for instance, there is no more perimeter. What about the impact of these insider threats? 3.8 insider attacks per org per year. That means most companies are seeing a breach or some sort of insider attack once per quarter. And based on the number of customers that I meet with, that number might be low. 45% or almost half of organizations have no idea if they've suffered a breach. It takes 270 days on average, according to Verizon, for us to determine that a breach has even happened. More than a third think that the cost of these breaches are over $1 million. I think that number's soft, and I know it's growing, because it's not just the financial costs when it comes to insider breaches. The reputational damage is immeasurable, and this isn't an IT problem. These kind of breaches and cybersecurity in general has board-level visibility these days. You see chief privacy officers, chief data officers. CISOs are tasked more and more with making sure that this data stays inside the organization and that the right people have access to it over time. I'm probably preaching to the choir here. If you're on a security webinar with Varonis and Sphere, you probably understand why data security is so important. Let's just give you some of the background, some of the landscape that we're seeing today. It's very easy to get inside the network. Again, 87% of the spend is on the perimeter, but it's actually really easy to get inside. Our employees are going to make mistakes. This is a terrifying statistic. Phishing works really, really well. Almost a quarter of phishing email recipients open the email, and more than 10%, more than 1 in 10, will click on that link once they've opened it. This is from the 2015 Verizon Data Breach Report. Think about that. It is exceptionally easy to get in, especially the biggest organizations. Spear phishing is even more targeted and more effective at getting inside the network. End-user training is critically important. I would never say otherwise. I actually used to run education and development for Varonis. I know how important this is, but you need to assume that if somebody wants to get into your network, they're probably going to be able to figure out how to do it. But we also need to worry about the threats inside the network. Abusive administrators. somebody taking their domain admin account and poking around the CEO's inbox or poking around user data, a disgruntled employee. So it's not just the mistakes and the malware, it's the rogue employees abusing the access that they have, maybe having access to data that they're supposed to, maybe having access to data that they're not supposed to, right? If you picked a random user in your organization, could you tell me with certainty exactly what data they had access to? Or if someone opened up a help desk ticket and said, hey, you know what, I need you to put Brian Vecchi in this Active Directory group because he needs to do some work, do you know what that group would actually give me access to? The answer for a lot of companies before they come talk to Varonis is actually no. We don't know the answer to those questions. So if we don't understand our access controls and we don't know how data is being used and we assume that people from the outside are going to get inside and have legitimate credentials at some point, might not be a question of when, but maybe it's not a question of if, a question of when, how do we stop insiders? How do we stop people once they're already in the network? Or how do we stop people that have legitimate access to our network? How do we make sure they're not doing something that they're not supposed to do? Well, it starts with gathering information. It starts with gathering metadata. The guy at Sphere told you right up front, it's critical to understand your environment. And understanding your environment means gathering metadata. Specifically, you need to understand your identities. You need to understand your users and group structures. You need to understand which users are in which groups, where groups are nested. You need to understand all of those functional relationships. You also need to understand permissions and access controls. And that means for every folder, all the way down the tree, for every SharePoint site, for every mailbox, every public folder, everything on OneDrive and SharePoint Online, everything in Office 365, everything on your Unix servers, your NAS devices, you need to go and on a regular basis, ideally once a day or even more frequently, interrogate those access controls and then map them back to the user and group permissions, because you need to understand, if I put someone in this group, what is that actually going to grant them access to? On the bottom right there, you need to understand content. The risk to an organization is really a function of two factors. It's the value of an asset multiplied by the probability of its loss. The probability of its loss is really how many people have access to this data. The value, though, is something that you as an organization need to determine, and that means scanning the content, finding out where you've got regulated data, where you've got PII, PCI, or SOX-related data, where you've got data that really needs to be protected, because from a risk perspective, somebody's iTunes library that they put on their personal home share represents some risk to the organization, but a payroll file that's on a SharePoint site that's open to domain users or authenticated users represents far more risk to the organization, because that's a valuable asset that has a higher probability of loss based on the number of people who have access to it. And finally, access activity is so important. You can't catch what you can't see, and you can't manage what you don't monitor. It's critical to understand how data is being accessed and by who, however they're getting that access. Critical to monitor everything. I guarantee you, if you went to see your CFO and you proposed taking off all record keeping when it comes to spending money in the company, you'd be called crazy, or might even be called fired, or might even be fired. We would never accept a state where we weren't monitoring how money was being used and by who. But we accept that state when it comes to data. We don't know how people have access to it. We don't know who it belongs to. And critically, we don't know how it's actually being used. That needs to change if you really want to protect your data. The question then becomes, once you have all of this information, once you've gathered all this metadata and you continue to create and gather metadata where it's needed over time, how do you actually solve these problems? These are really big problems. There's not a push button here, I've solved it, but there's a methodology that works. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you through the high-level approach for how Varonis believes our customers and others, whether you use Varonis products or not, Varonis believes organizations can have success in managing and protecting their data, especially over time. But there's a real methodology to it, and this is what we've learned from 5,000 customers being in business 10 years. We've gotten really, really good at this, but we've also seen projects that both use Varonis and don't. We've seen them fail. We know what goes wrong. We have a good plan and a sustainable plan, a repeatable plan for how to actually protect it. And it comes in three phases. It's relatively simple. We want to turn on the lights. We want to detect what's going on. We want to map the environment, monitor user behavior, and baseline it. Then we want to prevent disaster. We want to make sure that the access controls are correct and maintained. And that means that only the right people have access, and that permissions are simplified, and that we're identifying where users behave badly. And then finally, we need to sustain this over time. This isn't a one-time project. You're going to have half again as much data as you had next year as you had this year. Business needs and access control needs are going to change. So you need a sustainable process in place. You need to connect people, process, and technology to make sure that your data stays safe. And what I'm going to do today is I take you through this in a little bit more detail is give you an idea of how you can do that, how you can connect your people, your process, and your technology to make sure that your most critical assets are protected. So let's start with phase one, detect. By the way, before I get in there, if you've got any questions, the WebEx window has a Q&A window, and we're going to get to them at the end. We're going to have plenty of time for some questions. So if you've got some, just ask them there, and we'll get to them. Unfortunately, I'm traveling, and I only have one monitor today, so I can't see the questions come up as we go through, but I promise you we'll take some time to get them at the end. All right, phase one, detect. How do we turn on the lights? Well, if you think about it, again, we're talking about the problems that we have. These are CEO problems. If we need to turn on the lights, we need to answer basic questions. What did Bob have access to before he resigned? Do I have sensitive data stored in the wrong place? Are we getting hit with CryptoLocker? And why does that keep happening? Or other ransomware? Can I delete this data? How many vulnerable unused service accounts do I have? All these are basic questions. We could probably come up with a couple dozen more if I actually let you guys talk, which I'm not doing because clearly this is my webinar. But no, I'm joking. But the point is, if we sat at a workshop for an hour or two, we could come up with dozens and dozens of questions about your data that could be answered just by turning on the lights. So the first thing we want to do is map your environment. That means understanding permissions, understanding access controls, understanding Active Directory and other directory services, including local accounts, and mapping them all together. That's going to tell you who's got access to what data. It's going to tell you where you have data that might be open to too many people. We also need to classify sensitive information automatically. We need to interrogate the contents of files, find out where sensitive data is. And what that does, when we've done those first two things as part of mapping the environment, now we know where sensitive information is also overexposed and open to too many people. Think about the value that would provide. And by the way, at no point have we done any work yet. This is just the machine going out and mapping your environment. We also want to turn on auditing in some form. Generally, you don't want to use native tools to do this. Native auditing in Windows and Unix is a disaster for the most part. It's not something that you want to do. Even Microsoft says don't do it. But you do want a system in place for recording access, and that means recording all access, not on a single folder or a single share or even a server. For all this data, you should record all access by all users in a system that you can search and sort and query on, because that's how you're actually going to be able to use it. Once it's in that kind of system, though, you can start to automatically analyze it and profile, baseline, and alert on suspicious activity. If you gather every data touch by all users across all your data, you can then automatically figure out who are your admin accounts, who are your service accounts, who are your executives, who are, and what normal users look like. You know what's normal for all of those user accounts, and once you know what's normal, now you know what's abnormal. You can see behavioral spikes. You can see when users start accessing data that they never accessed before. Maybe they do have access. Maybe it's in a global access group, but wouldn't it be great to know when Brian starts poking around and accessing sensitive data, when he's never done that before at all in his career? What happens when an admin stops behaving like an admin and starts poking around in the CEO's inbox? Didn't you know about that? What happens when a service account stops behaving like a service account and might indicate that the credentials were hijacked? What happens when a normal user starts encrypting a huge amount of information in a really short period of time? That's odd. Why would that be happening? Maybe I want to go investigate that or even take automatic action. We'll talk about that a little bit. These are just, again, some of the things that you can do once you baseline and profile user behavior. And you need to do this for every event, on every file, on every folder, on every server, because if you don't, you're going to miss something. And the more data that you gather, especially in a system that can handle it, the more data that you gather, the better your profiles are. And that means the better your alerting will be on suspicious activity. PowerShell is an extraordinarily valuable tool, but we also want to see when people are using things like PowerShell to look for files that contain credentials. One of the biggest or most important vectors in the Sony breach, for instance, was the existence of files that had credentials for other servers. Once they were found, suddenly the keys to the kingdom are open, right? That's the kind of thing that you can do an alert on with Varonis and Data Alert Analytics, because we understand data sensitivity, because we understand normal user behavior. If people start accessing data that's got credentials in it or other sensitive data, we're going to alert you, and so you'll know about it. So when we detect, when we turn on the lights, we want to map the environment, know where sensitive data is, profile baseline behavior, audit all activity, and we can start alerting and identifying anomalous or other suspicious behavior. And by the way, at no point have we spun up a project, have we had to hire people, have we had to give people a lot of work to do. This doesn't take any work. This is the kind of thing that you can do in literally hours or a day or two. You now have provided much more value, much more insight, much more intelligence about your data without having to do any work. That's phase one, detect, turn on the lights. Phase 2 is prevent. We want to prevent disaster. Just because we understand our environment doesn't mean that it's properly configured, properly set up. If we've got data open to global access, if we've got users that that are in groups that they don't need to be in, all of those require change. And it's really important that if we're going to change the environment to prevent disaster, to put the right preventive controls in place, it's really important that if we're going to do that, we're going to do it without disruption, without getting in people's way, or without breaking any services or applications that might be using that data. The first thing that we tend to do is we prioritize and lock down the most sensitive data. Show me where I've got lots of sensitive information. Show me where that sensitive information might be overexposed, and lock it down. Make sure that only the right people have access to that data and that you're monitoring all of that access. That's typically the first thing that people do. Second, we want to eliminate global access. Generally, when it comes to unstructured data, there's very little reason for data to be open to everybody in the company, or especially everybody in the world. So you want to eliminate that access, but you need to do it sustainably. I just talked about change without disruption. This is really important. We had a customer, before they were a customer of ours, it was a large manufacturing company, and they had a project to remove the Everyone group and domain users from all of their file servers. They didn't have Varonis. They didn't really know exactly what this approach would, what the results of this would be, but they knew that they had an audit point to remove global access. So that's what they did. They removed global access. Well, they had an application that was using in this case, the domain users or the Everyone group, one of the global access groups, to access data on a big NAS. It never had a specific permissions configured. That data had been open globally, and it had been set up and working for years. Well, they removed the global access. That application stopped working because it could no longer read or write to that folder that it needed to. And it turns out that application was a critical piece of support for a very large manufacturing plant. That plant then went down for what turned out to be 3 days. This was a UK company. They lost 2.5 million pounds a day while that was down, just because of one permission change where they didn't understand what the impact would be. Now, that's an extreme example, but in general, when you start making changes to your environment, especially changes that could potentially have wide-reaching effects, like removing or eliminating global access, it's critical to understand what that impact would be. Doesn't mean you don't do that. It means you do it with a method that lets you do a simulation, understand the impact, find the user that would be affected, make sure that those users or accounts, service accounts or application accounts or what have you, continue to have the access that they need so your business isn't disrupted at all. This can be done, trust me. We also want to simplify our permissions and group structure. If you've ever looked at a file server, you may have seen inheritance turned off 50 levels down the tree. 50 might be high, but I think you know what I'm saying. The idea is you want to make sure that you're not using share permissions, you're only using NTFS, that your permissions are applied near the top of the tree and then propagate down so you don't have overly complex permission structures. You want to reduce the number of uniquely permissioned folders to make it easier to manage. And I think most critically, you want to have single-purpose groups. And what this means is for any folder that you want to manage, it should have a read group and a write group. And if you want somebody to get access to it, put them in the read group or put them in the write group, depending on the level of access that they need. That should be the goal because that's really a sustainable model. We'll talk about why in a little bit. You also want to get rid of the dangerous artifacts, inactive users, overly delegated groups, loop-nested groups, broken ACLs, all of this stuff that's just clogging up Active Directory in your file system that's relatively easy to get rid of. So get rid of all that stuff. You want to eliminate excessive permissions. Remember I asked you to do a little thought experiment a few minutes ago. Pick a user. Do you know what that user has access to? The answer is probably no, unless you're a Varonis customer. If you don't know what that user has access to, that's fine. Everybody else is in the same boat. But then let me ask you a follow-up question. If you know this user probably has access to data or is in Active Directory groups that they don't need to be in, how do you identify those? How do you figure out what Brian has access to that he doesn't need, right? What happens if I hire someone tomorrow? And I've been at the company I've been at Varonis for going on 6.5, 7 years now, and I hire someone tomorrow and I go to IT and I say, you know what, just clone my access because he's going to be doing my job. He needs access to everything that I do. Well, I've been at the company for almost 7 years now. I have access to a whole bunch of stuff. A lot of it I probably don't need anymore because my role at Varonis has changed 3 times. And I've been on a variety of projects that have given me access to things. Does that mean that my new hire that I just hired needs all that access? The answer is no. People are in groups that they don't need to be in because roles change. We're on projects. People get added by mistake. Who knows? But once you actually look at where people have access to data that they don't need, you start monitoring how they behave, you can actually identify where people are in groups that they don't need to be in. You can do that automatically, and that's critical for eliminating excessive permissions. So not only are we turning the lights now with not too much work, We've locked out our most sensitive data. We've fixed those AD issues. We've eliminated global groups. We've started to identify owners. I'm talking about that a little bit too. And we've simplified our permission structure to make sure that we can actually effectively manage our permissions over time without breaking the bank, either at the data center or from a resource standpoint. Phase 3, we want to sustain this over time. We want to make sure that our people, our process, and our technology are all aligned to best protect our data. And that starts with figuring out who this data belongs to. It's not IT. It's not even IT security that should be making decisions about access. It's your data owners. It's the people outside of IT that have the right context for who should and shouldn't have access to this data. And the wonderful thing that happens once you start monitoring behavior and once you start monitoring all activity is you can very easily identify who this data belongs to. You can identify your data owners. There's other pieces of metadata that certainly help, the permissions, the organizational hierarchy, who do they report to, things like that. But really critically, understanding who's actually accessing data is going to tell you who it belongs to. Once you've identified and assigned owners, get them involved in the authorization process. If I need access to your data, it's not me or my boss or one of your analysts at the help desk who should probably say yes or no to that, right? It's you. It's your data. You're a data owner. You should be involved in the authorization process, and that should be automated. So you should be approving or denying somebody's access to your data. Now you can be involved at the point of sale. Now you can make sure that risk is being reduced because the right people are making decisions about data. But remember those recommendations I talked about? Once you look at how people behave, let's automate the entitlement review process and get owners actually reviewing access to their data. That should happen once a quarter, at least once a year, right? But probably once a quarter, someone should be looking at who's got access to my data. But remember, we're looking at behavior as well. So if you were doing an entitlement review of the list of people who had access to your data, wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be very actionable from a data owner perspective to see who's not using that access anymore and likely doesn't need to belong in that group? So when you do the review, you can take them out and ensure that only the right people continue to have access to your data. Getting data owners involved in authorization and in the entitlement review process is probably the single most important thing you can do to sustain your security over time. You need to get the decision-making out of the hands of IT, put it in the hands of owners, but you need to do that with an interface, with a framework that was designed to scale and that was also designed to be nice and easy to use. The final thing that we want to talk about from a sustainability perspective is automating what we can automate. Think about all the information that you have about data. You know what's being used and what's not. You know what's sensitive and what's not. You understand permissions. You understand Active Directory structures. Well, with all of that, think of what you could automate. You could automate the quarantining of sensitive data. Someone puts some sensitive data in their personal drive where it's not supposed to be, quarantine it, move it somewhere else, leave a stub file behind that's only read-only, or leave a note behind or what have you. Automate that. Automate your retention and disposition policies. The single best way to prevent data from being stolen is to delete it. Get rid of it, archive it, lock it down, do something. Don't leave it out there with it's still representing risk to the organization. So once you have this metadata, once you're gathering it on a regular basis, you can automate your retention, automate your disposition processes and policies, and automate the quarantining or legal hold processes for sensitive data or other personal data. All of that is possible, and all of that will help you sustain this state over time. So we're going to keep monitoring all activity. We're going to keep catching breaches, insider attacks, or other abnormal behavior because we're going to continue to baseline a profile and update those profiles automatically as our needs change. We're going to quarantine sensitive data. We're going to get rid of the stuff we don't need. We're going to automate our retention policy, and we're going to get our owners involved in the entitlement review process and through the authorization workflow. If you want to protect your data from the inside out, these are three relatively simple phases, the first of which takes no effort whatsoever. Just spin it up, turn on the lights, start monitoring. And even if you do nothing else, you're way ahead of where you were yesterday. So turn on auditing, baseline user behavior, get alerted when something goes wrong, take inventory of your environment. Then start to put the right preventive controls in place. The detect phase is all about detective controls. Now put the right preventive controls in place. Make sure that people only have access to what they need to do their jobs and that you sustain that model over time and that access gets reviewed regularly, that owners are involved in the authorization workflow, and that you can automate the tasks that make sense to automate based on the metadata that you've got. It's a complete coincidence, I swear. Every time I get to this slide, I completely forget. Varonis is a software company. We're actually a data security software company. If any of this seems interesting to you, and you'd like to see it in your environment, we offer a free risk assessment, and we'll do this in conjunction with Sphere. We'll come in, install our suite, turn on the lights, map your environment, identify areas of high risk, and lay out a proposed operational plan and methodology for how you might tackle this, what those timelines might be on whatever platforms that you might want to support. So this is a free risk assessment that we do, and it's one of the best ways that you can provide value without having to actually spend any money. And we're really excited about that. We've had a huge amount of success, and we've given a lot of value to our customers with these risk assessments. So with that, that's the end of the presentation about why insiders are the new malware and the methodology that Varonis sees for helping detect, prevent, and sustain, and better manage and protect your data over time. So now, are there any questions? And I'm actually going to stop sharing this. I'm not going away, but I'm going to share it so I can see some of these questions. All right. We've got a few here. Just give me a moment to bring these up so I can see them. All right. How do I integrate, or can I integrate alerts from Varonis with my SIEM? For those of you that you don't know or don't have a SIEM is a security information and event management solution. There are a lot out there. Varonis actually has strategic partnerships with a number of the SIEM vendors, including HP ArcSight, LogRhythm, FireEye with their TAP platform. We're working on some of the other ones, and we'll be announcing those partnerships shortly. But in general, at a high level, all of the alerts that I've just talked about, the alerts on ransomware activity or abusive administrative access or suspicious activity on sensitive data, modifications to critical GPOs. I think there's more than 60 that we've got that are right out of the box now. All of those alerts can be provided via syslog, so we can send them to any SIEM. We can also provide SNMP traps, and with the integrations that we have with, again, HP, LogRhythm, and FireEye, and a couple of others, we actually will send off a syslog in the preferred template, so it's very easily parsed by those platforms. Here's another question. When there are new types of ransomware invented, will this solution still detect them? That's an excellent question, because if you've ever looked at ransomware detection at the endpoint or even on the network, they're really signature-based. They look for specific names of files or file extensions, things like that. That's valuable, and you certainly should be doing that. What Varonis does, and Varonis actually will look for some of those signatures, but all of our analytic threat models related to ransomware, or some of the ones related to ransomware, actually is machine learning to look at the file access order of what a ransomware attack looks like. Some of the more advanced ransomware variants these days work very slowly, so they avoid threshold-based triggers and try to behave like humans. But we still see that it's machine behavior. We still see the file access order. It was an open, a modify, and then renamed, an extension rename of the text file. It was an open, a modify, an extension rename. Open, modify, extension rename. We know what's happening because we look at the file access order. So that's a very long way of answering the question, yes, we will continue to identify new ransomware because we're looking at actual file behavior, and we actually have had success identifying new ransomware variants before they're even considered zero-day variants because we actually look at file access order. Here's a great question. I already collect log data from my systems. How will Varonis outperform my existing monitoring methods? Well, if you're collecting log data, especially if you're feeding it to a SIEM, generally what we see is that that's very useful for databases, applications, other structured systems, but that the unstructured data, the file data, the things on Windows and SharePoint, NAS devices, Exchange, Office 365, that's a real black hole. Logs generally don't exist for those platforms. So even if you're throwing everything into Splunk, for instance, I heard that a lot. We are throwing everything into Splunk. That's where we want to do this analysis. Well, you still don't have any analysis or intelligence about how your data is being used. So our approach then is to monitor that data with Varonis, send the alerts off to Splunk then, so you can see when something goes wrong. Here's actually a question that's a follow-up to that. Does Varonis require native file auditing to be enabled? Because that's how you would typically provide that data to a SIEM or other log aggregator. You have to turn on native file auditing, and the answer is no. We have agents for Windows, Unix, SharePoint, and Exchange. We use APIs for Office 365 and the NAS devices. So we actually create that log data. We never, ever write to disk on any platform that we monitor, so we have zero overhead from an I/O perspective. And generally, it's very, very lightweight monitoring. We're always under 1 or 2% CPU on the Windows boxes, for instance. And again, we never write to disk. So we don't require native auditing. We've got a much better way of doing it. And that actually the Windows file system filter, the kernel driver that we use to gather activity, one of the very first pieces of technology that Varonis ever built. So It's tried and true. It's been battle tested, and it's a really good way to get the audit data. Here's another question. What's the impact to the environment to have Varonis installed? That's, again, a great question. We have a distributed tiered collection method. So we've got a central application server and then tiered collection servers that sit physically close. As I mentioned, for the platforms that require agents, we never write to disk on any platform that we monitor. And it's generally on a server, 0 to 1% CPU, 6 to 10 megs of RAM. And again, we never write to disk. On the NAS devices, we're using APIs, so there's no overhead. Just, NetApp, it's F policy, EMC, it's KEPA. Other NAS devices have similar interfaces, and we use APIs for this data on Office 365, so there's absolutely no overhead there. What platforms are supported? Good question. Windows, CIS-based NAS, and I couldn't list all the NAS devices now, but EMC and NetApp are the big ones. That also includes Isilon, by the way, so we do support Isilon. SharePoint, Exchange, SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, OneDrive for Business, and Unix, as well as NFS-based NAS too. There's lots of flavors of Unix. If you're interested in our Unix, we support the vast majority of common Unix and Linux distributions. All right, let me go back here and see if there are other questions. Here's a great question. What strategies do you have for addressing cloud storage, such as OneDrive and Box? Well, good question. Right now, we support OneDrive. Everything that I just showed you, from forensic monitoring to behavior monitoring to permission simulation to just understanding effective permissions, walking the folder tree, walking Azure AD, we do all of that right now. We'll also show you the shared links in OneDrive, because one of the things about OneDrive, it's very easy to right-click on a file, create a link, and suddenly you have a public link to a potentially sensitive document. We do content classification in OneDrive and SharePoint Online, and we will in our very next version. It's in beta right now. Shared link visibility and auditing. So we'll show you how those links are being used and by who. As far as Box, we don't support Box yet. We are actively investigating and developing support for other cloud platforms, but I can't mention those since I can't confirm that everybody on this webinar is under NDA. If you'd like to know more about our future plans, though, by the way, feel free to reach out to Sphere or to Varonis. We'd be happy to set up a conversation to talk about a roadmap. We just need to get you under NDA to do that. All right, those are all the questions that I saw come in. Guys, do you have any other ones?
None from here. All
right. Well, then thank you all very much. It looks like the number of attendees has actually crept up since I started talking, which is generally a good sign. I'd rather it not be the other way around where you guys are so bored you're dropping off. I really, really hope this was useful for you, and I hope the Sphere guys are too, are absolutely really grateful that you've given us what turns out to be about 46 minutes today. Thank you so much. I hope this has been useful for you, and I really encourage you to reach out to Varonis, reach out to Sphere, talk about a risk assessment. There's generally no cost involved. You get a lot of value out of it. We'll turn on the lights for you. We'll show you how this methodology might work in your environment. We've seen it have a lot of success. Varonis has more than 5,000 customers now, and we've been doing this for about 11 years. We've gotten really, really good at it. We'd love to help you out if you face any of these challenges when it comes to your unstructured data. So to the guys at Sphere, to Dina from Varonis for setting this up, and for all of you, thank you guys so much. And Sphere, if you've got anything else, please send us off.
Yes, thank you. After the webinar, you'll be redirected over to a form where you'll be able to enroll in a breakout session as our partners at Varonis discussed. We'll be able to deliver some additional value to you. Please feel free to fill out the form, and a Sphere representative will be in touch with you to set up an appointment. Thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed the webinar.